Good evening. How's everyone doing? Let me try this again. Good evening. How are you doing? My name is Jordan Camp. I teach in American Studies here at Barnard College, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening. I'm also part of an initiative, New Directions in American Studies, and we're thrilled to host the launch of Nikhil Pal Singh's latest book, Race in America's Long War, published by the University of California Press. And we have some amazing scholars and intellectuals here today to help us think through the lessons of the book in a moment where I think the questions couldn't be more urgent. Christina will introduce them properly in a moment, but I want to begin first by thanking the MA program in American Studies and Columbia's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, and the MA program director, Matt Sandler, who's on the front row, for co-organizing today's event. Yes, please, you know. I also want to thank the Barnard American Studies program and our director, Jenny Kasanoff, who's on the front row, for the generous sponsorship and ongoing and enthusiastic support of our series. Thanks also, if you're watching, Niels Hooper and the University of California Press for sponsoring the event. And we also want to offer our deep thanks to the Provost's office and to Linda Bell for generously sponsoring our initiative. And last but not least, I want to thank Michelle Rowland, Mark Namadou, and Catherine McLean, the administrative assistants for CCIS, for their assistance. This event would not have been possible without the work of all these various units involved. So really, thank you so much. So without further ado, let me turn it to my colleague, Manu Vimaleshwari.
Hi, everybody. So I just wanted to talk really briefly about New Directions in American Studies, which is an initiative. I think that's the language we're using to describe what the three of us have been doing together. When we initially started working together, we very quickly made the decision to try to figure out how to work collectively, how to work collaboratively, how to use this space for a sustained collaborative intellectual project. So this is part of that. And we came together around some core themes, core focus that we have in this sustained project. One is anti-imperialism, the second would be anti-racism, and the third would be historical materialism. And I think the three of us would understand this as proceeding through in relation to queer and feminist practices and methodologies. And so the work we've done collaboratively, collectively, has taken a lot of different forms. Earlier in the day, we had a seminar discussing the book. We've had manuscript workshops. We've had a number of speakers come in. We're launching an oral history and activism project. And we're very committed to thinking about doing this work in Harlem, in the site of Harlem, and thinking about these questions of anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and historical materialism, or historical materialism as they've been thought in Harlem for a long time now. So this is one of the events we're doing. It's the book launch, and next fall, look for a conference that we're doing called Global Radicalisms, which will be here at Barnard as well. Thank you.
Okay, so good evening again. Good evening. Well, we could make this more awkward, but we won't. My name is Christina Heatherton. I also teach in American Studies here at Barnard, and I'm also a very proud member of the New Directions in American Studies initiative. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and in addition to the thanks that Jordan gave, I also want to thank all the student activists that are here tonight, as well as organizers from the group About Face, which is the former Iraqi Veterans Against the War. Your presence here is very much appreciated. So I'm really delighted to be here discussing Nikhil Pal Singh's new book. And I want to say that when you read a book that's as provocative as Race in America's Long War, you find that its arguments really start to shape the way you see everything around you. So Sunday, as I was watching the Academy Awards and rooting for Get Out, I was absolutely thoroughly distracted by the questions that the book raises. So thank you for ruining my Sunday, Nikhil. So I'm just curious, how many of you saw the Academy Awards? A few hands. I'm not in LA anymore. Okay, all right. So we all know Get Out was robbed. That's unfortunate, but I'm over it. I think the Academy Awards is always a really fascinating cultural moment. It usually reflects back the available articulations of ongoing cultural struggles. And I was so curious what that would look like in this moment of mass deportations, mass incarceration, Me Too, mass strikes, all power to the West Virginia striking teachers, as well as student-led struggles against mass shootings, all power to the Dream Defenders and the students of Parkland, Florida. The host, Jimmy Kimmel, was aware that the Oscars would be highly politicized, and he said at the beginning it was fine for people to talk about Harvey Weinstein, the Parkland shootings, Donald Trump. He only asked that people keep their speeches short and joked that the person with the shortest speech would win a jet ski at the end of the show. It was stupid. But, and as predicted, the acceptance speeches brought attention to really key political issues. They condemned sexism, celebrated representations of people of color, the inclusion of trans artists, and called on the industry to diversify its content and production. It was, as always, a little awkward, a little entertaining, and more than a little self-congratulatory. But midway through the ceremony, there was a tribute to Hollywood and the military. An indigenous actor, Wes Studi, the first Native presenter, I understand, in the history of the Academy Awards, came on stage and introduced himself as a military veteran. He expressed his personal admiration for Hollywood films that, quote, shine a spotlight on those who have fought for freedom around the world, unquote. He then addressed the audience in his native Cherokee language, which was another first for the awards. What followed was a montage of American war films. Early black and white battlefields merged seamlessly into the present, so that the beaches of Normandy, the damp forests of Vietnam, the dusty streets of Mogadishu, and the austere rooftops of Afghanistan all became one unbroken backdrop of war. In the foreground were American soldiers, a diverse mix of ethnicities, ages, and genders. Over the shots of men marching together, carrying one another, and embracing dramatically against the sunset was an excerpt from a Black Hawk Down monologue. Quote, when I go home, people ask me, why do you do it, man? You some kind of war junkie? I won't say a word. They won't understand. They won't understand why we do it. They won't understand it's about the men next to you. That's it. That's all it is, unquote. War, all American war, in other words, is not about politics. It's about brotherhood and belonging. Without context, without history, these depictions imagine American nationalism as a social bond forged against an eternally undifferentiated and historically inconsequential enemy. In the middle of this otherwise progressive cultural event, this unbridled celebration of American militarism and nationalism was stunning, but maybe not surprising. Imperialism has long been the blind spot of American liberal politics. While we have much available language to describe grievances around inclusion and symbolic representation, we have a profound inability to describe the animating power of racism, imperialism, and capitalism, especially as they co-constitute one another. I'm so grateful that Nikhil Pal Singh has intervened in this current moment. Through his scholarship, he asks us to think about the ways in which our opposition is often conscripted into the service of empire. His interventions could not be more timely or urgent. We are now 17 years into the war on terror, the longest foreign war in US history, and there is still no end in sight. There are many of you in this room who have known nothing but war, this war, and all the other offshoots of this war, from domestic spying, the vastly expanded policing powers, indefinite detention, arbitrary suspension of the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. And for everyone in this room, under the new administration, there is a new and great existential fear of how this war could expand. As someone who descended from people who survived both the atomic bomb and the concentration camps in the US, the fact that nuclear war is again a possibility is as disorienting as it is terrifying. While Nikhil asks us to consider this ongoing war, he also asks us to think beyond it. He asked us, for example, to consider the very processes of race-making as war, the way that the production of subjects of rights and inclusion, I messed that sentence up. The way that subjects of rights and inclusion are produced against what he calls the objects of dread and elimination. He asks us to think about the long history of slavery, exclusion, and settler colonialism, what civil rights legend Jack O'Dell describes as, quote, the road which leads from Indian massacres to the Pentagon. What I always appreciate about Nikhil's work is his insistence that we do not enlist old categories and formulation to describe related but distinct phenomena. He has long used his scholarship to push for new ways of thinking about, and therefore new ways of struggling against, racism, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and militarism. What he and our other panelists tonight, Chandan Reddy, might describe as a new grammar of struggle. At this critical moment, we need this grammar like we need this struggle more than ever. I could not imagine a better panel of people for Nikhil to be in dialogue with. I will introduce them all in the order that they will speak. First is Brent Hayes Edwards. Dr. Edwards is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, as well as a professor in Columbia's Center for Jazz Studies. He also directs the Scholar in Residence program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He is the author, most recently, of Epistrophes, Jazz and the Literary Imagination, just out from Harvard University Press, as well as The Practice of Diaspora, Literature, Translation, and the Rise of Black Internationalism, which won the American Studies Association's John Hope Franklin Prize, the Society for French Historical Studies Gilbert Chenard Prize, and many others that we don't have time to read. He co-edited Uptown Conversation, The New Jazz Studies with Robert G. O'Mealy and Farah Jasmine Griffin, and has also edited scholarly editions of classic works by Frederick Douglass, Joseph Conrad, and W.E.B. Du Bois. From 2001 to 2011, Dr. Edwards served as the co-editor of the journal Social Text and is currently a member of its collective. You'll see that the panel tonight is something of a social text reunion. That was by accident, not by planning. Next, we'll have Neferti XM Tadiar, who is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College, as well as the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. She is the author of the books Things Fall Away, Philippine Historical Experience and the Makings of Globalization, and Fantasy Productions, Sexual Economies and Other Philippine Consequences for the New World Order, which was awarded the Philippine National Book Award in Cultural Criticism. With Angela Y. Davis, she edited the collection Beyond the Frame, Women of Color and Visual Representation. Her current book project, Remainder Life, is a meditation on the disposability and surplus of life-making under contemporary conditions of global capitalism. And like many, I am eagerly awaiting her thoughts on primitive accumulation, gender, disposability, and time. Professor Tadiar is co-editor of the New York-based Collective and International Journal of Interdisciplinary Cultural Studies, Social Text. Next, Chandan Reddy. Dr. Reddy is Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, English, and the Program for the Comparative Study of Ideas at the University of Washington. His book, Freedom with Violence, Race, Sexuality, and the U.S. State from Duke University Press won the Alan Bray Memorial Award for Queer Studies from the Modern Language Association, as well as the Best Book in Cultural Studies from the Asian American Studies Association. Dr. Reddy's writings appear in multiple venues, including the South Atlantic Quarterly, Southwestern Law Review, and you guessed it, Social Text. The panelists will offer some introductory remarks. Dr. Singh will then respond before we open up a conversation. So last but not least, let me introduce the man of the hour. Nikhil Pal Singh is an associate professor of social and cultural analysis and history at New York University. He's also the founding faculty director of the NYU Prison Education Program. A historian of race, empire, and culture in the 20th century United States, Singh is the author most recently of Race in America's Long War. He is also the author of the award-winning book Black as a Country, Race and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy. He's also author and editor with Jack O'Dell of an excellent book you should all buy. You should all buy all the books, but I always give a special shout out to this one. The book is Climbing Jacob's Ladder, The Black Freedom Movement Writings of Jack O'Dell. Nikhil Pal Singh's new book, Exceptional Empire, Race, Colonialism, and the Origins of U.S. Globalism, will soon be forthcoming from Harvard University Press. His writings and interviews have appeared in a number of places, including New York Magazine, Time, and last but not least, he is also a member of the Social Text Collective. Again, by accident, not by planning. So I greatly look forward to our conversation, and I hope you will help me welcome tonight's panel and our first speaker, Brent Hayes Edwards.
Good evening. Thanks very much for that introduction. We've been asked to be brief, and so I'm going to be brief and just sketch out some areas for us to take up in further conversation. I want to say, first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real, I'm not sure that people knew, but it's a real pleasure to be able to respond to and be in conversation with one of my oldest friends. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to talk about Nikhil's work. I have a few points that I'm going to try to make, I think 4 points. And the first, I'll just say, if you haven't read the book, there's a pile back there for you to buy. It's an amazing book to read right now, as you were talking about, because it is such a vital intervention and such a timely intervention. But one of the things I wanted to reflect on and to ask Nikhil to talk about a little bit is the degree to which it's not only timely, but also time-bound. When I got to chapter 5, the present crisis, which, as Nikhil confesses in, I think, the first paragraph, is written during the first 100 days of the Trump presidency. That strategy of attempting to take what he calls in that same paragraph a longer view, in other words, not to be caught up in the inexorable ongoingness of the current crisis, but to look back and to make some longer durée sorts of arguments, is a really interesting strategic posture, and one I think I'd like to hear him reflect on further. In other words, what does it mean to historicize, to take the time to historicize, to do the research to historicize within these nauseatingly accelerated media cycles that seem to impose and enforce amnesia, where the lead story seems to be shifting not just every day but every hour. What does it mean to take the time to look back and to make the kind of long war, long durée argument that Nikhil does? I wanted to ask him, because it's really staged in the book, to talk to us about the composition of the book, and especially that last section where he's thinking about the temporality of its composition in relation to its argument. There are a number of takeaway arguments, phrases and sentences and formulations that I'll be sitting with for some time to come, that I could talk about at length, or that I won't. I'll just signal some of the things that I learned and have resonated with me. The argument that starts in the introduction and then runs through the book about the Indian Wars, as Nikhil phrases it, the ways that the Indian Wars are redeployed as an ideal for regulating and directing attitudes toward US state violence in the present, that ever-reproduced search for a frontier and the cleansing of a frontier is a really convincing argument and a powerful theme or thread that runs through the book. In the first chapter on race and policing, formulation like racism is the means by which war becomes normalized as policing, and police action licensed war. I mean, these are just some of the formulations that are condensed in with theoretical precision in the way Nikhil writes that, as I say, I'm taking away and I'm going to sit with. In chapter 3, the wonderful meditation and theorization of what Langston Hughes calls our native fascisms, about the relationship, the interimbrication between fascism in the US context and democratic liberalism, or the purported tradition of democratic liberalism. Or in the 4th chapter, that is partly a critical reflection on racial formation, the Omi and Wanant, that classic work on theorizing race. Here's another sentence to sit with. Not only have racial exclusion and racial inclusion paradoxically risen in tandem, but so have colorblindness and multiculturalism, which arguably stabilized as non-antagonistic, if contradictory, poles of contemporary racial common sense. There are sentences like this that I'm just giving you a few that I've chosen not at random, but as ones that I underlined and took notes on as I was reading the book, that, as I say, will stay with me. And one of the ways this book, I think, will work, not just as an intervention in relation to the particularity of a historical moment, but looking forward, is that there are these formulations that I will think with over time. One of the questions I wanted to ask Nikhil, because the book is such a powerful argument about the ways, he says even in the preface, the ways that historically, again on the longue durée, the structural violence of racial division and animus in the US has been renewed and renovated, I'm quoting, under the sign and aegis of war. It's a relentless, overwhelming, exhaustive argument, core argument that runs through the chapters. In some ways, it's so powerful, it's so convincing, and that imbrication of racism war that Nikhil charts throughout American history and the presence of American empire in the world is elaborated with such power that one becomes convinced of that connection between racism and war is one that is hard to think oneself out of. When one is confronted with what Nikhil proves, I think, is that combination, its nefarious complexity, its persistence, its resiliency, and not least, its adaptability, its ability to change itself on the fly in relation to new conditions. It's hard to think optimistically, and I wanted Nikhil to reflect on optimism because that's actually where the preface starts. He argues that the dispute over the meaning and interpretation of such basic facts around race and the ever renewed reproduction of war gives rise to intense political and ideological struggles, he says, over the boundaries of civic belonging and recognition and distributions of material harm and benefit. At times, the argument is so inexorable, feels so overwhelming, feels so adaptable and renewed that it's hard to see the ground from which struggle can be articulated and the ground from which one can take an optimistic stance, as Nikhil, I think at the end of the day, wants us to be able to do. So I wanted to ask him from what position one sees, from what vantage point optimism is possible in this conjuncture. Again, to read what I'm referring to in the preface, as a regime of power, Nikhil argues, racial ordering betrays political weakness, since it must continually secure and even coerce compliance and also prevent defection among perpetrators. It is unstable and ideologically fragile. Dependent upon morally discomfiting public force, it is subject to continual delegitimation. If there is a lesson that I hope to convey, it is not the inexorability of racial domination, but the record of social failure that its defectors, critics, opponents, and survivors have illuminated. But this isn't a book about the defectors, critics, opponents, and survivors. It's a book about that inexorable logic. And so my question is, from what stance can we hang on to or hold on to optimism? This may be another way of saying, it's both me noting one of the places where Nikhil and I have shared a conversation over many years, the ways that the archives of black radicalism, the labor movement, of politically progressive movements circulate and surface in the book. And it may be a way simply of saying that I haven't had a chance to sit down with Nikhil and have a drink and talk about Black Panther. but I want you to reflect on the politics of optimism. And one other point. Again, right at the beginning, one of the things he says about the logic of racism. Race, in short, is a modality of group domination and oppression, yet it requires a story, whether biological, sociological, anthropological, or historical, explaining how and why such practices persist and can be justified. And a little later, in another section, he argues, in the US, invasion, occupation, and territorial dispossession constitute not a singular event, but a structure of reasoning, feeling, even imagination, one that demands fealty and that orients attitudes toward the present and the future. One way to think about maybe a potential vantage point for optimism is in the politics of the imagination or the imagined form of racism. Because if it requires a story, then one can tell a counter story, or one can unravel the story or critique the story. So there are moments along the way, again, this is some of the ways that the archives of black radicalism surface. It strikes me that one of the things you quote early on, that moment from Ralph Ellison, from the prologue to Invisible Man, where the narrator says, our life is a war and I've been a traitor all my born days, an enemy, a spy in the enemy's country. There it's a counter invocation of war. It's a counter story. How can war be invoked as a figure of a counter discourse? A discourse that stands against or attempts to think out of or think us out of or think us beyond this inexorability of the imbrication of racism and war. Or Henry Dumas, another great writer from the Black Arts movement, his story Strike and Fade, that in the context of the urban inner city, in the context of Harlem, invokes the Vietnam War. Papers say we riot, but we didn't riot. We like the VC, the Viet Cong, we strike and fade. What does it mean to invoke, to tell stories about war in a way that doesn't simply reproduce the logic, the way it's imbricated with racism, but attempts to think us out of that logic? That's, I guess, to ask a literary scholar's question about the politics of the imagination in respect to a historian's intervention, but it's the only kind of question that I can ask as a literary scholar drawn to this sort of way in, or this sort of leverage, this sort of vantage point. I will stop there. I have more to say, but I will let other people talk, and I'll come back in the conversation. Thank you.
First, thank you, Nikhil, for writing this book. Thank you for the organizers for inviting us to reflect on it. And you know, it was very hard for me to not refract this book through the wars that I am familiar with, that are completely imbricated with the Long War and U.S. war in general, which is the, you know, I'm not even going to talk about the present because there's too much to say about that, but just the Cold War and the Philippine-American War. One of the wonderful things about Nikhil's book is what it allows us to think together, not just comparatively, but, you know, in the same frame. The intertwined relations, for example, between domestic wars and imperial wars, foreign wars, the slave labor and the labor process itself in the chapters on primitive accumulation, and the makings of the state, right? But what I particularly like, and I wanted to ask him more questions about this, is that he's very explicit about returning us to a political rubric for thinking about race. One that links it to state acts of war, to acts of state violence. And then in turn to think of contemporary forms of extreme violence as forms of race making, so war making and race making together. You do say at one point, though, that, you know, that it is a turn away from the anti-political rubric comprising terms like states of exception, bare life, social death, even race war. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about, and I wanted to think a little bit more about the politics of this critical discourse on race at this present time. What does it do, right? Because we are, in fact, very much in need of a critical discourse on race in a moment when I think that Nikhil is also very sensitive to the fact that at the same time that there is such blatant expressions of the violence that we can see as racist, there's also such an increasing abstraction and an embeddedness of the kinds of race-making in institutions, and carceral logics of war are in institutions and not simply in direct forms of racial profiling and racial constitution in the way that we recognize it from the past. So I did want to think about what is the politics of this narrative. I think Brent asked about, you know, that if racism requires a story, the critical discourse of race is also a story. And what is this story that you are telling? And as I said, I could not help but refract the story that you were telling over the longue durée through my own thinking about a long history in the Philippines, which is so imbricated with the US, but there are things that you invoke in the longue durée, for example, the just war, and the use of punishment, the history of punishment as part of race-making, and how that changes, how that's both continuous and changing over a course of time, and what the shifts are that we think are the important shifts, and to what do we attribute? To what do we attribute these changes? Is the story that we are giving. This allows him to think about racial violence and anti-blackness as ongoing constitutive basis of US civil and civic organization. It allows us to see war in the everyday governance of the US. It allows us to bring back slavery and settler colonialism and US imperialism in the everyday governance. And it allows us to bring the storylines of the inner and outer wars together. And as I said, my own revisiting of the Cold War, I started to revisit the Cold War and the Philippine-American War. It was hard not to read his book and not go back through these histories. And it has the value of bringing us to very grossly misunderstood moments in our history, both the Cold War and, of course, the Philippine-American War, which nobody, very few people even understood or even acknowledged exists, when 20% to up to 10% of the population was killed, and what could be construed as a genocidal war, a war in which I think the United States, and here I would question some of the timelines, because the timelines are very important because they're about the stories, right? The stories that we tell about when the logic of counterinsurgency, when and how this logic of counterinsurgency becomes part of race-making in the 20th century, particularly from the 60s to the present. And it's arguable that the form of counterinsurgency that develops in the Philippines, and I think other scholars have mentioned this, and particularly the form of collective punishment, is both intimately connected with the lynching that's happening, increased lynching that's happening in the United States at the same time. And it made me think about what the relations are between the targets of these different wars happening both simultaneously, and what the relations between and among these wars were for the people who were experiencing them. I think we have a gripping account of the way that the United States, and Brent mentions this, the way that the continuity of the United States, its ability to recover and to reshape itself and to develop the states is one kind of storyline. But then there's the other storyline of what might have or could have or did happen between and among those who were being made into races in the domestic and overseas sites of US war. And I'll just give you a couple examples because I think that what is particularly so persuasive and so exemplary about this book is the way that the determining logics and technologies and personnel of US wars, the racist fantasies that sustained this violence, was so global in its reach, right? But then it also, so we see this narrative of continuity, but then it makes me wonder about whether we could find other narratives of continuity that perhaps that narrative might obscure, or what might interrupt this narrative of continuity. The passage that Brent wrote about this being a testament also of social defeat and failure, right? I think those are very important moments. And I wonder what the relationship of this narrative would be to those narratives that might emerge from those points of failure. How we might tell the story from this other side of history. I will just give you one example from, two examples from the Philippine-American War that your book made me think of. One was, as I said, the role of punishment, in which I was reading congressional hearings of the United States in their thinking about the war and whether it was civilized or just, right? Whether this was civilized war. And what the American military was justifying was the burning of houses and the killing of the women and children, and they justify it precisely as punishment, and punishment that had a particular understanding of family, that it was. General Hughes says, the women and children are part of the family, and where you wish to inflict a punishment, you can punish the man, probably worse in that way than in any other. And it highlights for me the role that gender and sexuality have within this racializing logics and how important that is from the side of the state. But then in the same testimony, the same general also talks about how difficult the war was because the people's practices were always assisting everyone, right? You could not tell the difference between combatants and non-combatants. This was the guerrilla warfare. It had devolved into punishing everybody, killing everybody, because you couldn't make that distinction. And so we see precedents of some of the things that Nikhil is talking about in the contemporary moment. But it also raises the question of what from that side was an understanding of kin and family and, forms of social life. And that is the other question that I would want to raise. Because of the focus on war and the focus particularly on death, I think sometimes we forget that war is also a site of social reproduction and not just the assault on social reproduction. It is the question of survival, of how people survive, how people make life in war. And that is not always a romantic or a beautiful thing to see. It can be very predatory. So that violence here, I would like to hear a little bit more about the possibility of thinking of violence, even in the making of life in war, not just the violence from the part of the state. So how do we think about these forms of violence that emerge even in survival or as survival? The history of the police and the way that I think I will finish with this because I have much more to say about it. But I've been thinking about the police quite a bit. And the history of the police in the Philippines is completely tied up with policing in the United States. And so this is where I would want to see, how we relate to some of the things that are going on in the United States. And I want to credit Nikhil for making these thoughts possible because, talking about the Philippine-American War, the Vietnam War, the recasting the Cold War as a time of peace in the United States and abundance, but it was continuous war everywhere else, continuous counterinsurgency. And this is what I want two things I wanted to talk about, to mention. One is that in counterinsurgency, can we take seriously the fact and the cost and the enormous undertaking of insurgency? The counterinsurgency was not simply a racial fantasy, right? But there was a real insurgency. Part of the devastation in the Philippine-American War, despite the fact that the United States declared the war over in 2 years, they declared it, formally declared, is because the fighting continued for 10 more years. 10 more years. The hate that people had and their dedication to continuing that fight, that counterinsurgency does not happen without insurgency. And how do we take that seriously? Insurgency as a place of making life, right? How do we put that how do we bring that into the story? And so that's one. Just one way of thinking about that is mass incarceration in the U.S. has been very important to think with in thinking about anti-Blackness and racism in the U.S. But it was precisely this Cold War insurgency that allowed the offshoring of manufacturing jobs that made for the idle populations in the United States. Without that counterinsurgency happening during the whole time of the rise of the prison industrial complex, it would have been hard to, have this rise of the prison industry, right? And then I guess the last, and I will let my colleagues talk here, is I won't talk about disposability now. There's a lot more to say about that. I think I will read one thing from Nikhil, which I think is very important to dwell on when it comes to the chapter on primitive accumulation, about the incompleteness as being a permanent feature of capitalism. He says, what happens when those supposedly passive, archaic modalities most closely linked to direct coercion not only are retained within the labor process, but also shape the formation of the state? One of the wonderful things about this chapter is Nikhil attempts to show us the way that the forces of accumulation, very violent forces of accumulation, have devolved into the labor process, into the making of the state, rather than being a spectacular feature that was in the past. Okay, I think I will. I'm going to I'll say more about the police when we talk about the police, because the police, I think, the question about the militarization of the police is another place for us to talk about that. The police in the Philippines was always a militarized police. It was created by the US government. It was the Philippine Constabulary. It took the place of the Guardia Civil, which was under the Spanish colonialism, which itself was a militarized police. So there is a long history of the militarized policing here. And so which moments, what kinds of race happens, or what kind of race making happens over the longue durée, and what is missed? I'll end with one piece from when I was reading about black soldiers fighting in the Philippine-American War, about what happens when a certain moment of race-making isn't the kind of race-making that we understand in the current moment. Black soldiers in the Philippines understood themselves when, many of them, when they went to fight this first overseas war, following Cuba, understood themselves as being the same hue as Filipinos, right? I want to ask about what are these moments when we see black soldiers saying that they were the same hue, the same complexion as native Filipinos. When this man writes, we are now arrayed to meet what we consider a common foe, men of our own hue and color. Later on he writes, he says, whether it is right to reduce these people to submission is not a question for the soldier to decide. He says further down, he says, and he describes this war as a case of black regiments against black regiments. Although we know that the US military called Filipinos niggers as part of their pacification campaign, I think there's a way that how the US sees its race-making might bump against how those among the lower racial orders might see themselves in and of each other. What story could we tell? What stories might we tell in this other moment of possibilities that then doesn't come to fruition, and how would it relate to the story that you tell? Thank you.
Great. First of all, I just wanted to add my thanks, first and foremost, to Nikhil for writing this book and for writing it so urgently. As Brent was saying, when you read the book, you get the sense, and you start to realize that when you get to the very end of the book, that he was writing this up until the very last moment that he could before the press took it from his hands, and in part because he's trying to chronicle for us what Brent was calling the longue durée of practices that come as daily revelations of racism from the Trump administration. So when every single talking head in CNN and elsewhere is constantly talking about the declension of the American project and how we're in a moment of new forms of white supremacy, Nikhil is there in his room writing the argument that, in fact, these are not new moments, that there's a longue durée to this, and in fact, we need a kind of grammar that will help us stay in the duration and the temporality of race-making and what he calls race-making and war-making, to see that this moment is not one of a kind of declension that has brought a sense of hopelessness to people about the loss of political institutions, but that in fact, this moment is a repetition that, as he says at the end of the book, is a crisis that we cannot afford not to seize for our correct ends, but that we've been having training all along by these repetitions of transitions between what he's calling, what we might think of as liberal multiculturalism, or even before that, racial liberalism, and the sort of despotic orders of, for example, 1968 and the Wallace campaign, the eras of the Vietnam War. You could go further back, as Nikhil does, to US empire and so forth. So in a way, when you read the book, what you experience is that something about the moment of going between Obama and Trump is actually a moment of repetition in the longue durée of race-making and war-making. Even though there's a lot of constant change that he's accounting for, and the precision of this book is quite remarkable. You are given a kind of tour de force review of American intellectuals in their distinct historical moments from the 19th century to the present, but how there is throughout even all these distinctions the persistence of race-making as a way of exerting what he calls police powers upon others, racialized others, and war-making, which is about the mechanisms of producing sovereign exceptions to continue to expand the US economy. I want to thank him for doing this service for us. And the second is I just want to thank all of the folks who invited me to come out and join this panel. It's really, Manu and Christina and Jordan, I feel really honored to be here. I feel really honored to be alongside Nefertiti and Brent as well. It's kind of a, dream come true. All right, so I'm going to read a little bit because we only have 8 minutes, so I just thought I'd write some stuff down. I begin by just remarking that it's an unrivaled pleasure to participate on this roundtable on Nikhil's formidable and excoriating work on US empire, settler colonialism, slavery, and state racisms. Race in America's Long War poses us, its readers, a definitive challenge, asking us to think about what it means to think in a time of war. I think some of this has to connect with Nefertiti's comments. Asking us to think about what it means to think in a time of war. He reminds us, first and foremost, that wartime is, in fact, our time. Indeed, that perhaps for this nation, there has been no other time. And yet we continue to think, talk, and act, those of us with the privileges of papers and racial security, what we might call citizen subjects, as though exhausted by the daily reporting of drone strikes, terror strikes, military atrocities, corporate profiteering, and government contracts that leave unbuilt societies most US intellectuals don't consider part of their history, that we live in a time of elections gone wrong, or resurgent white supremacy threatening liberal democracy and capitalist multiculturalism, a time of national declension and racist resurgence. Indeed, that we prefer to think these times through nation time, even to kind of self-flagellate that the US is a white supremacist nation. Indeed, to think these times through nation time might be one effect of living not just in a time of war, but of living in the time of what Singh calls long war, as the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq pass the 2-decade mark, and the US war on terror completes the legal and legislative infrastructure for permanent war or endless war. That our ways of thinking, even our thinking about capital, industry, race, undocumented migration, anti-Black violence, and even to some degree water protectors and the environment, bring us over and over again into national time is exactly the issue that Singh's work brilliantly addresses. Race in America's Long War Race in America's Long War unearths the epistemic infrastructure that enables the ruse of wartime to appear as mere nation time. And more importantly, it argues against accommodations to this ruse. Singh suggests that the arrival of the Cheney-Rumsfeld doctrine of permanent war, that with the arrival of that doctrine of permanent war, we are perhaps in this moment in the position to make more generalizable what indigenous activists, Afghanis, Iraqis, Black New Orleanians, and all those whom Walter Benjamin termed the oppressed, vanquished by victor's history, have known all along. That these times, this nation time, is the time of war, or what Nikhil would call Indian wars. That wartime may in fact be the only time the Western nation has ever known. Indeed, in a book with turns of phrases as memorable as those of Du Bois, Singh reimagines the nation as a vast laundering apparatus. I just love this concept, the nation as a laundering apparatus, the liberal nation as laundering apparatus, one that washes the spoils of settler war, the blood, wombs, and bodies of the enslaved, and the booties of overseas territories, oils, and spheres of influence into a society of universal human rights, liberal democracy, and an imperfect multiculturalism. Indeed, like C.L.R. James's Black Jacobson's, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Cedric James' Black Marxism, Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, and more recently Sarah Haley's No Mercy, like those works, Singh's Race in America's Long War polemicizes against national periodizations, one that would mark the beginning and ending of wars, or slavery and emancipation. Instead, the nation, for Singh, is the epistemic machine of forgetting. To think the long war, we must abjure American exceptionalism and think the US rather as something like Western Europe's settler outpost, as the preeminent theorist of liberalism, John Locke, did. The longer view that Singh argues allows us to see, to imagine in the book, what we get in this kind of view of the long war is that we imagine that in fact European colonialism has been a kind of continuous project, and sort of forms of capital accumulation through European colonialism have been continuous since the modes of US settler formation, and that we don't actually have to periodize these as breaks in the rise of a kind of exceptionalist nationalism. So one of the things that Nikhil's arguing against is imagining the US nation as a nation, and instead imagining it as continuities of structures of empire that undo the discourse of exceptionalism and national periodization. For Nikhil, what we're reminded of is that in fact, if you look at the founding of the US, and particularly the attribution of citizenship to free white men in 1790, the nation is merely the means to achieve what the founders called a white republic. And that we might actually want to rethink. One of the great things about Nikhil's book is he's really forcing us to rethink what we think the nation is and does. That it's not the locus of sociality, and it's not the locus of civic bonds, but it's the locus of being able to ruse empire and imperial relations and a continuous kind of Western globalization into separate national communities. And I think that that's sort of one of the sort of key contributions. The second thing that the nation does is that it coordinates what we might think of as primitive accumulation with expanded social reproduction, or accumulation by dispossession with the forms of accumulation that operate through citizenship and civil and political representation, through freedom of contract. And for Nikhil, that coordination, how you fuse those two things together and make it look as though the story of one is ending and the story of expanded social reproduction is beginning, is the ruse of the nation form. But that you live, in fact, in the story of their conjunction. I'll just say, I just want to make sort of 3 final points that are maybe sort of points to talk about with Nikhil. And I think this has a lot to do with both Brent and Nefertiti's questions about, Brent's questions about optimism and some of Nefertiti's questions about thinking insurgency as well, which is that one of the things that Nikhil's work really allows us to think about is to critique the ways we've talked about neoliberalism. Because again, we tend to think of neoliberalism as a recent phenomenon, and we tend to think of neoliberalism as a sort of destruction of a democracy that actually never was in Nikhil's account. So even works by people like Wendy Brown or Lisa Dugan are really abraded for the ways in which they've sort of taken a presentist account of this longer process that in fact allows us to see neoliberalism as another iteration of what we might call the persistent war on Black life and on colonized social worlds. And so I think that one of the things that we could do, and that's what I mean by how he really opens up periodization in rich and important ways. In that understanding, I think we have to situate what we're thinking of as the sort of US exceptionalist empire, or the ways that the US exceptionalism operates, as being very deeply concerned about trying to demobilize decolonization. And I was wondering if, Nikhil, you want to speak a little bit about the specific efforts that this US empire is making to demobilize not just the projects of decolonization and what it was calling projects of communism, but also to demobilize what was the non-aligned movement of 1973 in Algeria. And you could think about also Mexico in '85, and what was called the new international economic order, the NIEO, that was the hope of so much of the global left, that was killed by the US in '75. And so I think that one way to think about Nikhil's argument about the US is that it's sort of the preeminent force of counter-revolution, and that it's been deeply involved in trying to produce an excision of effective forms of opposition and effective alternatives at both the global and regional and local level. And so that's one. The second, and Nikhil talks in the book about Nixon and the freeing of the dollar from the gold standard as a key moment in this story of US empire. So just connecting some of that with the stories of decolonization and the end of closed economies. The second is Nikhil's book really gives us a sense of the ways in which contemporary forms of violence operate through state bureaucracies, and through these sort of new administrative orders, and not merely as forms of group or collective punishment. And again, I think that when we look at this historically, and maybe Nikhil, you could talk a little bit about this, in a way, the achievement of the 1964 Civil Rights Act produces the conditions of possibility for the growth of the administrative apparatuses that come to regulate impoverished urban Black life and all kinds of zones of impoverished poor subjectivity, or poor subjects in the US and elsewhere. And so, in fact, rights production in Nikhil's account produces the conditions for administrative proceduralisms that actually come to dominate people's social lives. And so it's not the lack of rights that produces the forms of domination that he's interested in, but in fact, it is the granting of rights to people that expands administrative procedures of domination. And I think that one place where we can really see this is, and I'll sort of stop with this and one more point. One place where we can, I think, really see this, for example, is in the ways that Ferguson was regulated and policed. In Ferguson, Missouri, you'll recall that in the population, almost 85% of the population that lived there, from children to adults, had individual warrants of arrest. So what you have, and all of these warrants of arrest are coming from administrative violations for walking, crossing, jaywalking, violations for leaving garbage on your front lawn, violations for oil sitting on your driveway, et cetera, et cetera. These violations come with very exorbitant, for poor people, fines and fees. When those fines and fees are not met, you are in contempt, you get the production of a warrant, and then all of a sudden the entire city is being regulated through individuated warrants. So you're producing the outcome of group collective punishment, but you're doing it through mechanisms of administrative individuation where you no longer need to produce a discourse of racism. So nobody is anti-Black, but somehow they've got a warrant on every single person who's now a criminal to produce the same effects that anti-Blackness produced in the aggregate. And so I think one of the things that's important about this is to see what it's trying to do to social movement organizing, which is that it's trying to concentrate all of our focus in social movement organizing on freeing individuals from individuated administrative entrapment. So in the immigrant rights movement, one of the things that's been so inspiring, I think, at this moment is that all of the work is usually like, okay, well, I'll show you why this person shouldn't be in detention. Because all of the violence, even though it's collected, has been individuated. And so the movement is actually trying to work case by case, and it's trying to think about what it means to work against this administrative individuation that produces collectivizing effects. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think that the story that Nikhil tells is a story that we might think of as an interregnum, that we are in an interregnum and we don't know when we'll get out of it and where we are headed and what the sort of structures will be that will reconstitute what we might call those who have the rights of papers and their relationship to those who are paperless. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about how you're seeing the logic of the interregnum in sort of organizing the kind of book that you wrote and the openness that you leave in the book to those questions. Yeah, and I'll leave it there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before I try to respond to these amazing comments, I just want to once again thank Christina and Jordan and Manu for organizing this event. It really is, incredibly humbling and gratifying to have this amazing group of scholars who are really charting genuinely new directions in the field of American studies. Take up this work as a site for their own learning and for framing and thinking about this really important project here at Barnard. I couldn't have asked for three more amazing interlocutors, Brent, Neferti, and Chandan. I've known all of them for more than a decade, more than 2 decades in some cases.
More than some people, older than more than some of the people in this room.
Yeah, and you know, this has come out of years and years and years of conversations between us, although of course the older we get, the less time we actually spend with each other, and so sometimes this is telegraphed over a long period of time, and now the message is received and come back to me. So I'm really grateful for your remarks, and I can't possibly do them justice in the short time that I want to take here, because I want to allow a little bit of time for people to have something to say. So I'm just going to really try to speak very briefly to two things, I think. I'm going to try to, well, three things. Let me see. I want to speak to the issue of optimism. I want to speak to the issue of insurgency, and I want to speak to the issue of what Chandan called nation time. And maybe I'll do it in sort of reverse order. I think that Chandan is right, that I hadn't really thought of it, and I think this is what I often feel when I listen to Chandan, that he formulates my ideas for me much more clearly than I've formulated them. I do think that this book, as in much of my earlier work, is a protest against being forcibly conscripted into nation time, which is what happens to all of us. And I think since many of these essays were written in the Obama years, I think the sense was, Obama was the master of nation time as a kind of progressive teleology and as a story of inclusivity. And it became very hard in those years, as much as they were better than what we're dealing with now, to think otherwise, to think about how to relate to the question of the drone strike, to think about how to relate to the regime of mass deportation, to even think about how to relate to the regime of mass incarceration, all of which persisted on Obama's watch and in certain cases expanded, even as we were being kind of once again sort of wrung through the cycle, the wash cycle of the progressive teleology of the nation. And its inclusive, sort of forcibly inclusive modality, and so I think for many of us who thought this way, Trump wasn't really a surprise at all when he came along, and I certainly didn't think that Trump would win the election, but I wasn't surprised, and now I think. He represents a sort of another moment, maybe really a real rupture with that progressive teleology, but one that also opens some opportunities for us to actually think otherwise, because I do think that the struggle of this book, as I think both Nefertiti and Brent really astutely picked up on, is that it really is a book shaped by profound pessimism. I think that I think I really conceived of not the book, but of the kind of writing that went into this book after the 36 million people around the world marched against the Iraq War, only to see that war unfold in the following years, 36 million people. And it almost felt like that war was going to unfold despite our protests. In fact, maybe even because of our protests. And it felt that way in Seattle in 1999 as well, in the WTO protests. And it felt that way in 2006 when 11 million undocumented and undocumented people and their allies marched for immigrant rights in the United States. And it felt that way in the surge of protests around police violence that have been occurring all around us, which is to say that we are in an insurgency. We are in an insurgency against the unequal global order, and we are being disciplined into a conception again and again in the sort of famous formulation, there is no alternative. There is no alternative to global capitalism in its sort of neoliberal articulations, and there is no opposition, alternative to the nation time as understood from the standpoint of the overdeveloped world and its accumulations. And that to think otherwise is to invite anarchy, it's to invite destruction, it's to invite chaos, it's to invite terror, it's to invite all of these things that are going to strip us and rob us. And just in case you need reminding, we're going to strip and rob people in front of your eyes again and again and again to tell you that it could be you. And I always thought that that was the case in the torture in Abu Ghraib, and Susan Sontag basically said something to this effect, that the photographs were actually a disciplining moment as much as they were anything else. I mean, they certainly were a moment of race making and a moment to sort of construct the enemy in a sort of abject posture, but they were also a moment to kind of say, there for the grace of God go you, right? And you, subject of liberal freedoms, you can be stripped. And I think that the thing about that is that, and this is where I think I'm trying to make a real intervention in this book, although maybe it's not done fully, which is to sort of think about racism as a structure and as a mode of governance, not as an ideology and an identity, and not as something that's about the discrete construction of group vulnerability, but of the construction of all of our vulnerability. In a sense. And it's not that it's not differentiated, and it's not that there aren't unevennesses that we have to attend to, but that construction of all of our vulnerability is really extremely important. And it's from that vantage point, which I always took to be the vantage point of black radicalism, that I wrote this book. But I do think that there's a problem in this book that you've picked up on, really, I think, sharply, which is that and in a sense, the preface was the last thing that I wrote, where I say, almost plaintively, as Brent pointed out, it's the record of social failure of the racially governing order that I want us to record, and of the defectors, the critics, the survivors. But their standpoint is not in the book. Their collective experiments with life-making practices against the weight and in spite of the ongoing violence is not in this book. It's maybe in some of my other work, and I think it's in the practice of my scholarship and my pedagogy and the work that I do institutionally. But this book is very marked by the weight of this kind of period we've been living through, this onslaught, and I almost felt like I had to get it out off my chest to kind of say something about it, not to leave the impression that we are in fact subjugated, but to identify in a kind of maybe my own sort of unremitting way. The sort of once and for all, of course it's not true. I mean, that's a kind of arrogance or desire maybe, that we see it this way. Like, let's see what we're dealing with. I'll never forget this moment, right before the Iraq War, when we were told that, the war was fine because the American empire was like no empire in the world because it wasn't built on conquest and it wasn't built on the white man's burden. But in fact, the American empire has always been built on conquest, and it's always been built on a form of race-making. And it is, as I think Chandan pointed out, continuous with the longer history of empire, which is now, in a certain way, under the guise of the end of empire, even the end times of race, leading to a much wider ambit for accumulations by dispossession and racializations of entire populations that are now left in a situation where they're vulnerable, even if they may have formal rights, as you were saying. I think it's something like 77 million Americans have arrest records. Yeah. That's like 1 in 3 adults. I mean, there's a massive criminalization of populations. I think Bernard Harcourt's book, which just came out, is sort of making this argument in a very sort of direct way that's quite sympathetic with some of what I've written, that the counterinsurgency is really the mode of government. It's a sort of the permanent counterinsurgency. And I think that was something that governing elites really began to recognize in the United States after 1968. They really recognized that they were up against a moment when things could really turn against the warfare state, where the idea of the welfare state as something that actually couldn't be limited, not even nationally, right, was on the agenda with the new economic order, but also internally with the stretching of the welfare state to include those who had been excluded under the sort of the New Deal Compact. And I think King really named that moment very clearly, in the year before he was assassinated, when he talked about the intertwined evils of racism, materialism, and militarism. And I think that that agenda that he put forth at that moment, is still our agenda. And where the interregnum begins, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it begins then. I think the failure to resolve the question of empire, the failure to really resolve the question of black citizenship, and the sort of even longer failure to resolve the question of what the settler project has meant. And of course, that's also the moment that the Israeli settler project takes off, 1968. I mean, it's 1948, but 1968, it's given the sort of impetus that now brings us into that crisis in its present. I think these are all the questions that still roil us and that we struggle with. So in a certain way, I think I'm really thinking against that conjuncture, if there's any, and then sort of trying to think about a longer frame. So I know all of that's very telegraphed here in sort of responding to these incredibly thoughtful and rich comments. And I'll just leave you with a final line. Malcolm X once said about King, he said, he'll indict and give you hope. I'll indict and give you no hope. And I feel like I wrote 2 books like that. One was Black as a Country, which was indicting and giving hope. And this one, I think, isn't very hopeful, but maybe it will allow me to sort of get it off my chest and think about what is next, because I do think that the challenge of our moment really is the challenge to widen the imagination of solidarity and what that actually means. And I think we really are, in an interesting way, coming to that. I think we're all very tired of certain kinds of identity politics, but I think we all recognize that the kind of multiform violent differentiations that we're being subject to are things that we need to be sensitive to in their totality, right? And I think that kind of sensitivity is a sensitivity I see in my students, which really blows me away all the time, And I think that I'm never critical of the sensitivity to the sort of small aggressions of daily life that sort of affect us all in different ways. The challenge is how we begin to scale up, or scale up is even the wrong way to put it, because scale can sometimes be disempowering to think in terms of. But I guess how we take those sensitivities and sort of make the forms of life that are worthy of them. And I really think that that's something that I see happening all around us. And I really do believe that this is a moment for us in that sense. So I'm not truly pessimistic in that sense. But I think giving form to that optimism narratively and otherwise, and thinking about how to express it is something that maybe I'm not the most gifted at doing, but others will. So hopefully this book will be useful to that project. So thank you.
Well, I wanted to give the panelists a chance to respond, but I also want to make sure that people in this room have the opportunity to ask questions. So I'll take a few, and the panelists can either choose to respond to them and also any other comments that have been made. So does anybody have any questions? And I don't think we have a mic, so you'll just have to stand up and be loud.
I was curious about your view about the welfare state and its relationship to things like race-making, neoliberalism, the Liberal Project. Can you say anything about that?
Maybe take a few.
Yeah, we'll take a few. Other hands?
I guess I wonder if you could just reflect on the utility of the term fascism and like how it appears in the work, or if you think it's useful. I mean, I guess just because I've been looking at the U.S. role in the Civil War in China, and right after World War II, and like the way that some U.S. Officers sort of saw the Chinese nationalists basically as fascists, and yet, well, I guess I want to say and yet they supported them, but actually it was not an and yet. It was like, we see you as fascists and we support you. And then those people, kind of after the Civil War ended, had a huge influence on domestic political life in terms of, you know, the Red Scare and just sort of pushing for more aggressive foreign policy in Asia. And so, you know, it's just like, it just seems like there's this, this way that fascism actually was recognizable all along among foreign policy, people who supported aggressive foreign policy for the US. And then, you know, you mentioned the kind of the Langston Hughes notion of like the domestic fascisms and sort of like local despotism of police, so figuring out ways to connect those obviously is the project of the book, but like, I guess my basic question is like, what is the utility of fascism? Does it help or hinder our understanding of the US project in this period?
We'll take one more. I'm sorry, you know, I haven't read the book, and this may in fact be a rather basic question, but I think it might be really interesting to hear more about the tension differences and the stakes that are behind two different ways of conceptualizing race that you spoke about, in terms of ideology and in terms of, what is it, administration and state government. Yeah.
Is that's a good answer for me.
38.
Okay. So I'm not sure what I'm not sure if there's anything I really fully want to say about the welfare state. But maybe I can get at it through the question of fascism, and maybe somewhat also through this, also address this question of kind of administrative violence or race making as a kind of governing project, rather than sort of something that we think of in necessarily in sort of ideological terms primarily. There's a line. There's another book I'm working on, and there's and one of the things I kind of discovered what I was doing it is this speech that Robert Taft gave in 1950, and Taft is the kind of you know, the sort of leader of the Republican Party at that point in time, and he's always considered a kind of moderate Republican, but even then I think the moderate Republican was a sort of somewhat of a mischaracterization. And he says, you know, that fascism is much less of a threat in the United States than socialism, because the American people might actually be attracted to socialism. And I think that's a really interesting statement, because I think American elites really do understand I mean, this is maybe a very flat-footed way of putting it, but they really understand the need to manage the need they have to manage divided collectivity. Like, divided collectivity is actually very important to the project of governing, especially in a place where democracy is the kind of shibboleth, right? And you know, you can really find that going all the way back, and I write about this in the book, this moment where the first laws are passed in Virginia that basically say what distinguishes slaves from servants, white people from black people, is that white people get to keep their clothes on when they're being whipped, but black people get to be stripped naked when they're being whipped. And this sort of idea of this kind of differential being the differential of race I find very interesting, because it kind of suggests something also about the kind of meager returns of whiteness, that whiteness itself is, you know, not this kind of great sort of achievement or privilege oftentimes. And you know, Calvin Schermerhorn's new book shows this too, in terms of the kind of history of the slave South, that, you know, slavery impoverishes white people, right, terribly in the South. White people are better off than slaves. I'm not saying that there isn't a difference, but there's a kind of way in which that management of divided collectivity, which is sort of central to race making, is a kind of ongoing American project. And I think it's in a sort of very basic way the kind of truth of fascism, right? It's sort of the understanding of the kind of the kind of ongoing sort of effort to produce the kind of the sort of specter of violence at the core of a population that occupies the same political space, you know, and sometimes even the same social space. You know, and I think of that as, you know, sort of somewhat of a relentlessly American thing. You know, maybe it's fascism writ small because its tributaries sort of run so through the kind of everyday experience of American life. I was thinking about this recent thing that I just read about how you know, local counties are taking up ICE's you know, offer to be deputized in the immigration hunt, you know, which is a law that dates back to the Clinton administration, which basically says that local police can basically go around asking you for your papers, and if you don't have them, God help you, you know, whatever, you might get locked up, you might get beaten, you might get deported. I mean, I only just renewed my passport, and I was thinking, what happened if I'm driving through some rural Texas county and someone stops me? I mean, there's impunity, right? And there's a kind of a licensing of impunity now, not in terms of something called the rule of law, but in terms of the protection of the space of sovereignty itself, right? The sovereign right, you know, and that's kind of how lynching was understood. There are all of these different kinds of moments in American history that have operated in that idiom. Ida B. Wells famously called it an unwritten law. Right, the unwritten law, and Malcolm X talked about it in very similar terms. He said, you know, the Bill of Rights for the black man is that, you know, you find yourself on the wrong end of the policeman's nightstick, right? And this kind of aspect of American history, I think, that Langston Hughes called our native fascisms, is something that we haven't really, I think, fully grappled with, and instead we get a narrative coming out of World War II that tells us that no, we in fact defeated fascism, and we are the opposite of fascism. Even as the Nazis, you know, going into World War II are developing the Nuremberg laws on the basis of American Jim Crow laws, or looking at the United States and Great Britain and saying they're not necessarily going to oppose what we want to do in Eastern Europe, because after all, they were expansionist powers who are spreading civilization to benighted peoples, and are kind of shocked by this. So there's something that comes out of World War II that has sort of, again, produced a certain kind of story. And I don't want to totally discount the story that came out, because there were a lot of progressive forces fighting then as well in different directions, both inside the US and globally, against fascism in a really true sense, right? And those forces are going to continue to contest. But it is, I think, the case that the American story after World War II is mostly a story of counter-revolution, as Chandan said. And King says that too. And the 60s are really the test of that, right? As you know better than anyone. And Stuart's just written an amazing book that's going to come out next year that's really going to change the conversation about the history of counterinsurgency and policing in the United States. But that moment in the 60s, I think, is the moment that sort of where it goes as far as it's going to go, I think, right? And the counter-revolution really comes home, you know, in a very sort of direct way and in a very articulated way. And we're still dealing with its fallout, and I think we're still dealing with its consequences. And I think Obama was a sort of a moment that really scared a lot of people in this country, because as moderate and cautious as he was, and as much as he was a kind of part of the laundering operation, and as much as he was about kind of steadying the ship of state, I think the energies that went into the election of Obama really did represent something that seemed to suggest that another world was possible. You know, and then the impetus was to remind us, no, in fact, not. And that's the thing that keeps happening again and again. No, another world is possible. There is no alternative. But, you know, the fight goes on, and the insurgency goes on. And I think clearly, you know, it's not gonna stop while we all have, you know, breath in our bodies. So that's my best effort to try to tie those three questions together.
So I'm really sorry, but
Yeah.
I've been a terrible timekeeper. I promised the booksellers that I would give ample time for Nikhil to sign books. So if anybody has any more questions, I encourage you to buy a book, ask the question, have Nikhil sign it. But before we go, I hope you can join me in thanking the panel. Thank you all for coming. It's been a terrific conversation.